In the autumn of 1972, the American Indian Movement, AIM, led a cross-country protest known as the Trail of Broken Treaties. AIM, along with thousands of other American Indians, took a stand against the inadequate living situations on reservations and the oppression and discrimination towards American Indians in our country. Although they planned to present a 20-point paper to the Nixon administration, which clearly defined and established the demands of American Indians across the nation, in Washington, D.C., they instead occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA. The Nixon administration promised that their demands would be fulfilled, but over a span of 30 years, American Indians are still waiting for all the points to be addressed. AIM continues to be a prominent force in the fight towards American Indian rights, leading marches and protests that demand attention from the mass media, thus giving momentum to the movement and its goals.
When British colonizers first arrived in America, they recognized tribes as sovereign political entities and entered into treaties to acknowledge and affirm Indian-owned land. After the American Revolution, the new United States government, through the passage of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty in the Constitution, at first also recognized the political sovereignty of the tribes and their right to exist. From 1823 to 1832, the Supreme Court, in three major decisions known as the Marshall Trilogy, reaffirmed tribal rights in land possession, tribal sovereignty, and defined a trust responsibility between tribal governments and the federal government. This trust responsibility stated that while tribes were domestic, dependent nations, the United States was responsible for their health and welfare. The United States even went so far as creating a Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, in 1824, and in 1869 appointed the first American Indian, Eli Samuel Parker, to lead this government agency. Despite this respect and recognition on paper, the U.S. government didn't always live up to its words, often forcibly removing American Indians from their land. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, causing a tragic event known as the Trail of Tears to occur. This was the forced removal of 5 civilized tribes from the southeastern U.S. to newly acquired land called Indian Territory, which is now known as Oklahoma. American Indians tried to protest and refused to move and lose their rights. As Sitting Bull said, "If we must die, we die defending our rights." However, the U.S. government continued to struggle with recognizing tribal rights. In 1953, President Eisenhower and Congress terminated national recognition of certain tribes. A key part of this termination plan was to relocate American Indians in an attempt to encourage assimilation and economic self-sufficiency. This would lead to the relocation of many tribes, and their land being sold to non-Indians, thus ruining the economic base. American Indians needed to find a way to fight back, and they found their ideas in the protests of other oppressed minorities.
During the 1960s and 70s, civil rights was the main focus of many organizations. The Black Panthers, for example, led many protests and marches that inspired the formation of the American Indian Movement. AIM was co-founded in Minneapolis in 1968 by Clyde Bellecourt, Dennis Banks, Eddie Benton-Benai, and George Mitchell. The organization was originally formed to fight police brutality against American Indians. However, AIM did much more than that. In November of 1969, AIM sent representatives to meet with American Indians at Alcatraz Island in California to illustrate the scarcity of the resources on reservations. The Trail of Broken Treaties, inspired by Alcatraz, protested the violation of over 500 treaties. A few of them include the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814, and the Treaty of Fort Armstrong in 1832. Clyde Bellecourt uses a drum to exemplify the spark that American Indians felt after Alcatraz. He states, "The drum had been silent for so long, it was now being heard from coast to coast."
The Trail of Broken Treaties began in the late summer of 1972. A caravan of American Indians started in the East Coast and traveled to the West Coast, stopping at reservations and urban Indian communities for support. As Mary Crodog describes in a book, Lakota Woman, the American Indian movement hit our reservation like a tornado, like a new wind blowing out of nowhere, a drum beat from far off getting louder and louder. I could feel this new thing, almost hear it, smell it, touch it. Meeting up with AIM for the first time loosened a sort of earthquake inside me. The caravan stopped in Minneapolis, Minnesota to create a solid 20-point paper that clearly addressed the needs and demands of American Indians across the nation. Most of the points revolved around treaty rights, such as the President of the United States should create a group of Indians and non-Indians to review treaty commitments and violations. But others included everyday rights, such as violent offenses against American Indians should be treated as federal crimes and the persons committing the crimes must face federal penalties. And the federal government should work on improving and creating better housing, education, employment, and economic development for American Indians.
On November 3rd, 1972, the caravan arrived in Washington, D.C., along with thousands of other American Indians from across the nation. AIM timed the protest specifically for this year and month because of the presidential election. They knew they would get massive media coverage of their protest and their movement. However, when they arrived in D.C., they found that they had no place to stay. The elders who had joined during the trip had been exhausted. Leaders of AIM went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to request hotels, but to no avail. According to the press, the protesters became very aggressive and militant. They stormed the building using force and violence to run out government officials. American Indians present at the time, such as Clyde Bellecourt, described the situation much differently than the media. As the protesters were leaving the BIA, the younger ones were shoved by guards. Being a large group in a new place, they were fearful for their lives and thought they would step outside to face the District of Columbia riot squad, so they seized the building. Desks and tables were turned over to make the barricade so the police couldn't break in easily. Wooden legs were broken off desks to create defensive weapons. The group occupied the BIA for a week.
With the unplanned occupation of the BIA, the 20-point paper was never formally presented to the Nixon administration. However, Hank Adams, an American Indian activist, created a partial solution. American Indians would receive $66,000 in transportation money to go back to their reservation safely. However, the federal government could not press criminal charges against AIM or the protesters, and the 20-point paper must be reviewed and taken to court within 60 days. After protesters left the BIA, there were tours of the building. Some of the protesters who were proud of their work went on one of the tours and were shocked to see that there had been slogans, symbols, and signs graffitied in places that had been spotless when they left. The damage left behind added up to thousands, maybe even millions of dollars, and turned the nonviolent group into a militant and aggressive one in the public's eyes. However, it was later revealed that there had been government officials among the protesters whose job was to give AIM a bad reputation. Congress continued to ignore the struggle of American Indians across the nation. In 1978, they tried to pass 11 bills that would impact hunting and fishing rights for American Indians. Dennis Banks responded by holding his own protest known as the Longest Walk. This protest, inspired by the Trail of Broken Treaties, started in Alcatraz and went cross-country to Washington, D.C., to again march on Washington. Dennis Banks states, "What we did in the 60s and 70s was to raise the consciousness of white America that this government has a responsibility to Indian people."
The Trail of Broken Treaties created an environment that helped American Indians thrive. Indian health groups were created, Little Earth United Tribe was founded, a legal rights center was made, and so much more. AIM continues to fight for American Indian rights. The most nationally renowned protests include No Dakota Access Pipeline, No DAPL, and Change the Mascot. Both protests play a huge role in advocating for protection of tribes and debunking stereotypes around American Indians. Change the Mascot is specifically meant to stop the dehumanizing and stereotypical mascots that sports teams use. One of the most offensive mascots is the Washington Redskins. As a huge advocate for this movement, Clyde Bellecourt states, "The R-word is no different than the N-word. Little Red Sambo has got to go." No DAPL protests the construction of an oil pipeline through sacred land on an American Indian reservation in South Dakota. If the pipeline leaks, as many have in previous years, it would poison over 17,000 people's main source of water. It's obvious that the federal government is still struggling with treaty rights because the construction of the pipeline is in direct violation of the 1851 and 1868 Fort Laramie Treaties. Fortunately, there are many non-Indian supporters of AIM, including celebrities, that go to protest and use platforms to voice their alliance for the movement.
The protest showed that American Indians refused to be silenced. It shows that racism is not just a black and white issue. The whole world is watching, and you must always ask yourself, what can we do to protect future generations? American Indians chose to stand up and fight. In case you forgot, we're still here.